Did you know that a well told story can change minds, inspire action, and even connect hearts? Whether it's a personal tale or an epic legend, stories are truly what has shaped humanity. I'm Callum Richards, and this is my podcast where I'll be taking you step by step in real time, me starting, growing, and ultimately running my business to bring you new insights, lessons, and tips that you can start implementing to your business right now. This is the real journey. Welcome back to the show. Today, we'll be speaking on the importance of storytelling on our daily lives and within our culture. Whether you're going to be using it as a form of connection, a form of persuasion, or even just to showcase your heritage and your own family values, your own internal values. Storytelling is a massive, massive importance to us, whether you're an extrovert, an introvert, a podcaster, or a listener. Being able to tell a story and invoke emotion within the listener is going to be a massive, massive skill that is always going to be worth using. So, of course, we'll start off by deep diving into why does storytelling matter? Well, a big part of it is, of course, going to be history. Without stories from 10 years ago, 50 years ago, 100 years ago, we wouldn't know any history whatsoever. And the best part about history is we can learn from it. We can learn through listening through different tales of the same story, through different sides of the same argument. We can learn exactly what happened, exactly what people did that went well, that worked well, and we can reinvent it and use it ourselves. And more importantly, we can work out what went wrong and hopefully we try and avoid it. Because, as I say, the idea of the story being told from both sides is just perfect because 9 times out of 10, it's usually somewhere in the middle. And there'll be certain aspects of a story that one person will embellish a little bit. And then there'll be other sides where they'll try and throw it underneath the carpet. Comparing the both of them when it comes to history is a massive, massive thing for all of us to be able to pinpoint how accurate a story is. Another key aspect of it is stories shape our personal identities. Every single story that you have, and you have loads, every story you have is personal to you. Even the stories that you share with your friend, with your partner, with your relatives, it hit you different. You have a different perspective of it. And that's what is so amazing about it, is it ultimately creates our personality because the same story can have a completely different impact on two different people. And so when you look back and when you're telling your own story, when you're using your own stories, or even just having a casual conversation with somebody and hear an aspect of their life that they've gone through, you may have a story that connects to it. Now, whether you tell it or not is going to be down to yourself. I would personally encourage you to, because I think stories are definitely worth being told. But you will have your own experience tied to even a complete stranger's aspect on life, because you might have had some form of dealing with it, whether it be good or bad. So they make us us because, as I say, every single person has a story, and every single person's story is completely different. And what I'd like to do within today's episode is encourage more people to start telling theirs, because I think it just boosts a massive part of your confidence when you are able to tell a story correctly, but also sort of tell it with confidence, tell it with you're proud of that story, or you're proud you made it through that story, you're proud you were there for that story to unfold. And it's a key element of just our personal lives, which of course then encourages us within our business lives as well. What you can also refer to when it comes to stories is it can build a sense of community there, and especially when it comes to culture, there are definitely countries within this world that rely so heavily on their ancestral heritage, where they feel so strongly about it that it actually makes part of their day to day routine. Now, this is regardless of things like religion. You can bring it to close to home to myself within the UK. You'll very rarely meet a Scottish person that is not overtly proud of being Scottish, because they have so many stories, so many parts of history where they fought for their own sort of freedom and independence, that it makes them unapologetically proud to be where they're from. And I wish that was the case across the board for every person from their country, because I think we should all take a sense of pride of who we are and where we're from, especially when you look back at history, because majority of societies or majority of countries will have a deep rooted history. They'll have something that is there to be proud of. I guess obviously the problem nowadays is some history is obviously thrown in a very, very negative light, which I do understand, which is why it's key that we learn from it. But it's good to know a lot more about yourself. I feel many people have found more out about themselves now through learning about their past. So, of course, stories, they just help build that sort of connection with, again, you and a complete stranger, because whether you know their last name or their first name, if you're linked through some sort of history within the families, it can almost be like a bloodline to them, and it's very, yeah, it's very powerful indeed. And I also want to touch on the relevance that storytelling has today. Storytelling is probably one of, if not the biggest content, viral content piece that you can put out there. If you watch any podcast at all, stories are the biggest aspect that they push on. Now, there's always things like values and, sorry, providing valuable content and providing entertaining content, but storytelling loses the viewer in just a world of its own. Personally, again, as a short form video editor, I love storytelling on a podcast, because you can literally take the viewer on a, a whirlwind of experiences through sounds, through things like visuals, through matching the music to the tale that's being told within the podcast. A person I will reference here, because he spoke about it directly, is if you look at somebody like Donald Trump, who has referenced to his storytelling as the weave, and how he masters the weave because he's taking you to a destination, but rather than just going straight there as a crow flies, he'll sort of, take you off here so you can look at the sunset, and then bring you back onto the road, and then he'll take you over here to the beach and then bring you back. Storytelling can captivate audiences very quickly, especially when you structure it properly, which we'll go into a little bit later on down into the episode. But I don't want storytelling to be overlooked, and I don't want it to be me saying, when I say storytelling, I don't want you to imagine you sat in a nursery with a kid's book reading The Hungry Caterpillar. That's not what storytelling is about. Storytelling is portraying your own personal experiences, and potentially even experiences of other people, but how it's impacted you. It's the emotion that you invoke, it's the way that you tell the tale. You can have 100 people read the same storybook or reference the same story, and they will tell it 100 different ways, because some people are going to resonate with different aspects of that same story and focus heavily on other areas. It's also going to have different emotional impacts as well. Some people could hear a story and feel angry. Some people can hear a story and feel very happy or very sad. There's multiple ways that storytelling can benefit you. And especially as an entrepreneur, whilst when you're coming into the now social media run space, your personal brand's going to rely heavily on you being able to put your stories across and making them as memorable as possible. So it's always going to be a skill that's worth developing, that's worth focusing on, and just worth practicing, even if it's something like starting a podcast or recording yourself and viewing how you spoke, what you said. Did you hit the right emotion here? Did you put in enough detail here? Did you paint a picture for a potential listener? So storytelling has massive relevance in today's world, and you'll see some of the biggest names on the planet using it to an absolute T. Now, a very personal story to me, and one that I very rarely share, is actually a story of how I become a father. Now, this is very impactful, but not in a traditional way. I actually came very close to losing two of the closest people in my life at the time. And the strange thing is I don't tell this story as the main character. I actually tell this story as more of the narrator because I was very much aware at the time that whilst everything was going on during the labour, that this was not about me. This was not about my feelings or about my emotions or about me even telling this story at some point. This was about my missus and this was about my soon to be newborn child. And to cut it short, there was some very sort of problematic issues during the labour stage and during the delivery stage. And I remember sitting there looking, and I don't want to say I wasn't scared. I think every man in his right mind would be scared, but there was no time for fear at that point. There was no time to worry. There was no time to ultimately show any form of emotion. Can almost say it was like an out of body experience of me looking over the top of myself, thinking this is where you become the rock that you talk about all the time. This is where you become the man that you portray yourself to be all the time. This is where you show your kid that this is how a man's meant to be. This is how you show your missus that she chose the right man. Because it was it was one of the hardest situations I've ever been in my life when you're completely powerless and pretty much left to the doctors in the room and the powers that be of whether these two people that you love with all of your heart will survive. And it will forever be what it will forever be a reference point of what made me the man I am today. Is because from that point, I sort of realized that there is no genuine fear other than life and death. And there's nothing even scarier than losing your own life than watching the two people you're meant to protect in this world potentially lose theirs. And there's not a damn thing you can do about it. That story for me will be the almost start of my hero's journey or of my real journey because from that day, I no longer worried about what other people are going to think of me. I no longer worried about trivial fears such as judgment, such as failure, such as anything like that. Any of the I genuinely will call them trivial because when you're up face to face with what could be a turning point in your life completely, it would have changed the course of my life massively. There's nothing that matches it. There is no greater agony than bearing an untold story inside of you. As I've mentioned before, we all have stories. Some stories that you tell can inspire other people. Some stories you tell can aid other people. And some stories you tell can present an opportunity that would have otherwise passed you by. Get used to telling your story. Get used to putting your own voice, your own personality out there, because ultimately that's what every single one of your stories is. It's a part of you. Only you went through it, and only you felt the feelings you felt as you were going through it. No one can replicate it. You can write it down on a piece of paper and show it to every single person on the world, but they're still not going to feel the way that you felt during that time. And that is one of the greatest aspects of the story is there's not a single one that's going to be the same. There might be some similarities, there might be some characteristics of the hook or characteristics of the ending that might match. But your story and your brother's story and your mum's story and your dad's story, all of your growing up in childhood are all going to be completely different because it's going to be down to your perspective of it. And you should be very used or should get very used to putting that out there, to telling people exactly what happened, exactly what made you have the mind frame that you've had, what made you take the course of action that you have, what made you make the decisions that you've made that have led you to where you are and where you're going to be. That's your story. That it's all part of the journey, funnily enough. And I didn't set that up ahead of time, I can promise you that. Stories are great. Stories can be a very big reflection on yourself. The story I will just mention there, hadn't thought about in a very, very long time. Knew I wanted to let you guys into a personal backstory of myself, of something that I've experienced that I'd probably put down as the most traumatic experience of my life. I've had loss in the family and things like that, and I've felt grief, but that was traumatic in terms of I was scared. I genuinely, even though I didn't show it, I will vouch for that. I don't think I had shown any ounce of emotion because of the situation it was. But that's the power of something like that is unless I had told that, unless I had spoke about that, most people wouldn't have known about it. In fact, nobody really would have known about it because it's not something we touch on. But it also is a realization for myself that I'm actually a lot stronger, even when I don't feel like I am, even when there's other situations that come up and I feel like I've acted weak. There's always that one reference point that I can go to and think, no, no, because when push comes to shove, when I needed to be the man that I speak about being, I was him and I did it. And you can do that same thing for yourself. There are going to be stories that reflect who you genuinely are as a person and who you wish you could have been at the time. There's going to be stories that you're going to regret. We all have them, unfortunately. But rather than sitting and sort of sulking on them and moaning on them, take them as inspiration for what you don't want to be and what is the version of the story you'd like to be able to tell, and start being that person now. So if you're ever put in the same situation, you'll have a different story to tell. So they're very, yeah, they're very impactful ultimately. And as I say, I didn't want this episode to be I mentioned storytelling and everybody's gonna think I'm talking about all these entrepreneur books or all of these fantasy books. By the way, a big fan of Harry Potter, but it's not the point. Storytelling's a massive part of your business because when you're growing a personal brand, you need to be able to showcase why you are the go-to person or why you have got the mindset and the capabilities that people are looking for. It is a business related skill. Now, of course, there's other avenues that you can use it towards. And if the opportunities present themselves, I'd definitely encourage you to do so because it's just better to speak in public. It's better to hone in all skills that you can. You can speak well in public, you can speak well in private, you can speak well in private, you'll close more deals, make more networks. It's just going to benefit you by implementing something like this, testing it, and trying to make it better. I know storytelling is a big area of the podcast and just on a general life that I want to focus on, and not in ways that I had before in the past where I'm speaking about stories where I got smashed and was out until 4 o'clock in the morning. I want to speak about genuine things that I've done in my life that I'm proud of, or even areas of my life that I'm not proud of, but I know would never happen again. Tell your story, write them down, record them on audio, record them on podcast, whatever it is, whether you're proud or whether you're not, start telling your story and getting used to making that part of you. If you do want to start writing down your story and you actually want to start practicing speaking in front of the camera or on audio, it'll be very good to follow a structure. So, the initial part of telling a story is the hook. Now, this is very similar to a video. It's an attention grabber, captivating. It's something that is going to make people swiping or stop twiddling their thumbs. A hook is going to be used in every aspect of any content that you're making, and story is ultimately a story you're telling is ultimately content. So if you're writing it down, you want to write down the whole story. And what I would love when I hear people's stories, or what I love when I see certain films do it, is when they start with the end in mind, or they start with the actual end at the beginning and then bring you all the way back. It's a good way that you can do it. There's multiple other ways you can bring the hooks in. You could start with a number, you could start with results, you could start with an intriguing statement or statistic, something like that. You can always test them out. You can always check out other videos, other podcasters, other people that are famous for telling stories and see what is it that they do that hooks the audience in and how can I implement it into my storytelling. Or you can tell the story in 100 different ways to 100 different people and see which one got the best response. The second part is going to be the structure. So you want to obviously use the beginning, the middle, the end. So you've hooked the listener in, or you've hooked the viewer in, dependent on how you're telling your story. You've got the beginning, you introduce some details into it, a bit of a backstory, understanding the situation that the person, whether it's yourself or somebody else that's in. Obviously, you've got the middle. This usually be where the main bits of action are, or the main points of focus are going to be. Again, you bring in some more detail, you add in a lot more description, you probably even introduce some emotion, how they were feeling, how you were feeling, why you were feeling that way. Then you have the ending. The ending would then lead you onto what is the emotion that you're trying to implement. Is it a sad story? Is it a happy story? Is it a motivational story? I would personally say you should do that in mind throughout the entirety of writing or speaking about your story. Are you trying to write a story that's going to be emotionally motivating for your audience? Is it going to be something that gets them amped up and wanting to go fight a bear? Or is it something that's going to be a little bit more solemn? Because what you'll notice then when you have the emotion in mind is when you're speaking your story, you'll understand the narration that you have to also take with it. For example, if you're speaking in a motivational manner, if we take somebody like David Goggins, he's got an extremely, extremely motivational voice. He's got motivational body language. He goes about his overall life as if he's just a motivational sort of tape on wheels, because that's just how he portrays himself. But then you'll also have other speakers who don't have that impact. And it's not necessarily their voice, it's how they speak, it's how they narrate the story. So if you've always got that emotion in mind, you can switch and change up how you impact, where you put emphasis, where you leave a little pause. Do you leave a little pause, or do you go straight into the next part? You'll start adapting every story you're telling to match the emotion within the story itself ultimately. Now, I would also add in certain situations a CTA or a call to action. Now, this again is going to depend on why you're telling the story, or why you're ultimately creating this piece of writing, piece of video, piece of audio. Because, as I say, this is mainly going to be for things like social media, for things like promotion, where you're trying to sell something, or you're trying to get the audience to do something. Now, again, you can argue that you put this in any type of content, there's going to be some sort of CTA. It might be that you get somebody to write something down, it might be that you get somebody to go to the gym, or it could be that you get somebody to buy your service, or listen to your podcast, or go and buy your product. A CTA is always going to be something that's good to have, and you want to try and implement it even when you're not necessarily speaking directly to the audience that it's targeted for, but just so you get that practice in. So, as I say, if you do start writing down your stories and start practicing speaking them, follow that structure, and I'd love to hear your stories as well. As we touch on hearing from you guys, we're now going to move on to the viewer questions part of the podcast. Now, again, I've not had any viewer questions from yourselves yet, so I've asked our good old friend AI. As always, if you want to send in any of your questions, just go to crvideoeditor.com. You'll have links to all of my social media pages, as well as my email and the podcast, of course. Any way that suits you to get your questions in, just send them over. You can comment on the video, whatever suits yourself. I'm more than happy to answer them within the podcast, or just directly there and then. But we'll move on to the very first viewer question, as I say again, generated by AI, which is, how can I tell a story that resonates with my audience? So the biggest part of this is knowing who your audience is. Because if you're telling a story that you want to motivate 40-year-old men into joining your gym, you're not going to tell that story the same way you'd tell it to kids. You need to know who your audience is first, because again, people are going to react in different ways. Now, even 40-year-old men, there's going to be different parts of 40-year-old men. Some 40-year-old men are going to react better being swore at, being told to do something, being told that they're something. If they don't do it, Let's put it in that way to keep this PG. Whereas other people are going to need a gentler touch. Other people need a little bit more persuasion. Other people need a little bit more encouragement. Oh, it's okay if you don't do it, but it'd be good if you do. Me myself, I like to be shouted at. If I'm shouted at, told to do something, or better yet, if I'm told I can't do something because of X, Y, Z, you can almost guarantee I'm going to do it. At some point, I'm going to do it. For example, when I see hate comments on some of my videos saying how many followers I've got, or listeners I've got, or views I've got, or whatever it is that they want to slag off. As usual, it's the faceless accounts that do it. It's also the accounts that have got no content out there. But it's also, always see that as a sense of fire, because there's going to be a point, whether it's a year, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, where they're going to come back across my videos and they're going to have the views that they were slagging me off for not having. It's going to have the following that they were slagging me off for not having. And they're going to have to ultimately look and think, I potentially could have been where he is if I just took action rather than slagging him off. But each their own. I come away from the point. That's how I personally like things. I like being kicked a little bit. I like sort of being shouted at. Other audiences are not going to be suited to that. So dependent on your message is going to depend on the best way. Dependent on your audience is going to depend on the best way to portray your message. So if you pick the best audience, you'll know the best way to make the story resonate with them. Moving on to the second viewer question generated by AI was, what are ways to overcome storytelling anxiety? So I've touched on this a little bit, but I'll go into a little bit more detail. Recording yourself is going to be a big factor. I know that when I very first started my personal brand, I wanted to do it faceless. And then I changed my profile picture to a picture of me. And then I started doing stories of me. And then I started doing profile reviews with my head in the corner of the video until I got to the point where I was like, well, my face is out there now. I might as well just make videos of myself. And I made videos of myself. I did not realise how bad my speaking was. I thought I spoke pretty well. And I think I do face to face, but there is a massive, massive difference when you're speaking face to face and seeing human interaction and seeing human reactions to your joke or your story or whatever it is, compared to looking at a lens, which is ultimately what I'm doing right now. I have no idea what your face is going to look like when you hear this recording. I have no idea whether this resonates with you. It's all a testing phase at the moment. But speaking to a lens brought me much more anxiety than I would feel speaking face to face, because in my 9 to 5 I speak to loads of people every single day, every single week. Could speak to thousands of people within a month's period, or at least hundreds of people within a month's period. So the face to face never bothered me, and I can have a conversation with most people. So I would highly recommend, to get over the storytelling anxiety, is first write it down and speak in front of a camera and record yourself, watch it back, and do that on repeat. Do that once a day. Do that once a day. Write a story, but what I would encourage is write a separate story every single time, or write the same story in a different way, and see what has a bigger impact on you. You'll hear comedians go through this a lot, is they could write 1,000 jokes and they'll go to smaller gigs, smaller sort of comedy bars and things like that, and they'll test all of those thousands of jokes, and then they might test those thousands of jokes 5 different ways. So then they're testing 5,000 jokes, and then by the time they come to have a special, or they come to have a recording, or they come to do it in front of a main audience that they want to impress, they've honed it in because they've practiced it so much. Now, these are people who have been in comedy for 5, 10, 15, 20, 30, 40 plus years doing this. They still do it to this day. So there's absolutely no reason as a beginner you can't start to action daily, writing, recording, looking back, feeding back, and going again. And I can absolutely guarantee you will see a massive, massive benefit in that. I would argue within the first 2 weeks, because you'll realize if you've got any crutch words that you sit on. You'll realize if you go all the time. Oh no, I noticed, and I hope I still don't do it now. I'm probably gonna do it loads in this episode just to flag it even more. I would take a breath sort of halfway through a word. I think I still actually do it here and there, but I'm trying to control it and be a little bit more conscious about it now, because it was annoying. And being a short form video editor, there's certain things that happen within videos that I'm very, very much aware of. So, say cutting people in, or stuttering, or mumbling, or those things to a video editor in general are so annoying because you have to be so exact on where you make the cut so it doesn't seem all robotic. But I never picked that up doing my short form videos because I'd do the short form where I'd speak a sentence, look at the script, speak a sentence, look at the script, or speak a sentence and then move and speak the next sentence. I only picked it up doing long form. So another suggestion I would have when it comes to sort of overcoming your storytelling anxiety is record yourself for a long period of time. Maybe even start off by reading a book and then start writing. But I just think writing your own story is going to give you good practice. It's good to write, it's good to speak, and it's always good to feedback. So that'd be my tip for that. Now, how can storytelling enhance my professional life? So again, as I touch on the personal branding side of things, it's going to be massive because the better you can tell your story, the better you can give your audience credibility of why they should listen to you, why they should follow you, why they should buy your service or buy your product. You're going to improve that relationship with them. You're going to prove being that guy, that trusted guy within that trusted field. It's also going to help you when you're networking with people because people are going to understand you can speak. Speaking's an underrated skill. Everybody thinks they can speak until they're put on a stage or until they're put in front of a camera. Everybody thinks they can speak. And again, as I mentioned earlier, found this out personally myself. Everybody thinks they can speak until they're put in a certain situation. If you can show that you're just that person who can do it, I'm always reminded when I talk about storytelling is the film, I believe it's The King's Speech with Colin, I think it's Colin Firth or Colin Farrell. I've got both of them wrong, I believe. And it just shows you imagine the pressure that he's under and put anybody else in that situation, the pressure he's under and he starts to stutter, he starts to mumble. That could happen to any of us. That might not I know within the film he had a certain speech impediment, but that could happen to any of us because when you're put on the spot and you've got that amount of pressure, you're not the same person as what you are when you're speaking to your mates or to what you are when you're speaking to a camera. So just developing your storytelling skills, being able to, as Trump would say, make the weave, bring people back and forth into different topics. It also would help in just keeping an audience engaged or keeping people engaged if you're at a party or if you're at any sort of social event like that. Because rather than just saying, I woke up, I went to the shop and I come home, you are able to throw in other little tales, you're able to bring in other little areas. For example, me myself, I want to work a lot more on focusing on how I can bring in my video editing into telling my stories because whilst I'm very happy making this podcast, I'm very happy engaging with the audience. I'm very happy just growing a personal brand and speaking in front of the camera just in general. I genuinely enjoy doing this. I also have a service, which is short form video editing. Now, I don't want to do it as blatant as this, and this is a terrible example, but I'm just trying to show you guys what I mean. I want to get better at weaving it in to the podcast and weaving back out of it, and weaving it into the podcast and weaving it back out, because then it's still present. It's still something that somebody could hear that's in the market for a short form video editor and think, Callum Richards got a podcast, I message him. It works well for me. But at the same time, I don't want you guys to be sitting there like, oh, Cal talking about his video editing again. So it's going to benefit you massively within your professional life. I just think speaking in general and feeding back to yourself. I'll watch this episode at least twice, once when I edit it and twice when it's released, and I'll listen to it to see what I think as a listener and where I can improve. So get recording, get writing, get telling your story. Win of the week, and it still hasn't took off just as yet. So I will keep promoting, I will keep pushing these. I want your guys' wins on this podcast. I want you guys to be telling me what you've achieved. I want to be shouting out your socials. I want to be helping you guys and just connecting with you guys as well. So of course, send in your wins of the week any way, shape or form. Just go to crvideoeditor.com. You can message me whatever way suits you best. So for this week, I'm going to make one up. This is a very good opportunity for me to practice more in-depth storytelling. It was a cold, dark night in Oxford. No, I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to tell you how we'd run through it if there was actually a win of the week. So, Joseph is this week's winner of the week, and Joseph shared his story of overcoming addiction in front of the right crowd, and is now actually a spokesperson for A, B, C company. I don't know any addiction companies. I do apologize. It's a terrible, terrible example, but you can see how it'll go. You've got his name, you've got what he did, and you've got the benefit of what he did through doing what he did ultimately. And then I'd just list a couple of socials. As I've mentioned before, if they're a little bit difficult to say, I'll just include them in the description below, because last thing I want to do is send people searching for the complete wrong name when I've shouted you out on the podcast. Yeah, last thing I want to do. So that is the win of the week. And remember to start getting them in. Of course, after the win of the week comes the much anticipated tip of the week. This one is going to be pretty simple in, I've pretty much already mentioned it, but journaling, reflection, sort of focusing on what you've done that day, writing it down, highlighting the key moments. Was there a funny story in your day today? You might not have noticed it at the time, but when you're reflecting and when you're looking back, there might have been something that you could say to people. There might have been a lesson that you've learned through something that had happened. There might have just been something that you saw and you had your own sort of internal monologue about, but didn't make any notes on. Reflection and journaling and writing those things down are going to benefit you massively, because again, you can bring this into practice when it comes to telling your own stories, and you might start to realize that whilst you could be sitting there now thinking, I've got no stories, when you reflect, when you look back, you realize, oh, I've got loads of stories. I can, you know, they might not be suited for this audience or for this audience, but they're definitely suited for an audience who are looking for a laugh, or an audience looking for motivation, or an audience that want a bit of a sadder story. They're definitely suited for them. Now, what this does entail is being present. So, if you'd want to learn any more about being present and how you can start introducing that into your day to day life, go and check out my previous episode where we spoke about mindfulness and just sort of being present and aware in the moment, because that'll definitely help with journaling and making your storytelling better as well, which is perfect. And ultimately, you just need to realize you've got the story. You have got stories. You have got plenty. And you can start telling them right now, today. Finish listening to the podcast. Go and write a quick 5 paragraph essay now. Go and write just a couple of sentences, a powerful quote that you like. Maybe something you've heard me say today, or maybe just something you've heard at some point during the past week. Something that resonated with you. Write it down and record yourself saying it, and record yourself saying it in multiple different ways. You could do a 5 minute recording of a 3 word sentence, but you can just put emphasis on different words. You can start it in a different way. You can close it in a different way. Focus on telling the story, not the context yet, just telling and getting your speaking skills up to scratch with the stories that you're going to be able to tell as well. This right now is part of my story. Whether this podcast goes on to get hundreds of millions of views, which it will, or just becomes a weekly reflection where I get to engage with a couple of my audience and speak with them, answer their questions. This is all part of my story. This is all part of me. There's no fancy editing, there's no insane background, there's no fancy camera tricks where I'm panning here and there. This is as blatant as it can be. This is just me speaking to you and telling stories, telling my side of things, giving you my insights. This is something that absolutely anybody can do to start their story off. And again, I massively encourage it, because I'm seeing benefits for me already, and I'd love to see the same for other people. And a big quote that I'd like to drop here is, if you do look to start telling your story and you do look to recording yourself, is be unapologetically you. Don't look to be like somebody else. Don't look at all the top podcasters and think, I'm going to be like them, or I'm going to be like this person, or I'm going to be like this influencer over here. Just be you. Be you in front of a camera, and be you sort of raw. As tough as it's going to be at the beginning, when you're not the best at speaking, when you're not the best at looking at the camera, when you're not the best at positioning yourself and your body language and all those sorts of things, it's still going to continue to happen as you get on. You're going to be improving, you're going to be putting yourself out your comfort zone, and that is crucial to telling your story. A story you can, of course, start telling is the fact that you were here from the beginning. You've been listening to The Real Journey before it went mainstream, sold Spotify for 500 million and knocked Joe Rogan off the top spot. And I'm only being semi-sarcastic there. But on a genuine note, I want to thank all of you guys for listening. You are truly here at the beginning of the Real Journey story. A story that is going to continue on next week as we hit our first major milestone of 10 episodes. I've got something very special in line for that episode, so make sure you don't miss it. Till then, you can of course find me at crvideoeditor.com. Links to all of my socials and of course the podcast there. Till then, I've been Callum Richards and you've been listening to The Real Journey.